On a humid morning in May 2008, in the quiet corridors of a Tennessee apartment complex, a young woman named Tabitha Tuders vanished without a trace. She was 13 years old, a seventh grader at East Nashville Middle School, last seen walking to catch her school bus at approximately 6:45 in the morning. Her backpack was found abandoned near the bus stop. Her shoes were discovered later that same day in a nearby alley. But Tabitha herself seemed to have disappeared into the very air of East Nashville, leaving behind a family desperate for answers and a community gripped by fear. The investigation that followed would become one of Tennessee's most haunting cold cases, stretching across years of silence, whispered suspicions, and a truth so disturbing that, when it finally emerged, it would shake the foundations of everything investigators thought they knew. What really happened to Tabitha Tuders on that ordinary spring morning, and why did it take so long for the truth to surface? East Nashville in 2008 was a neighborhood in transition. Once a thriving working-class community, it had weathered decades of economic decline before beginning a slow, uncertain revival. The streets were lined with shotgun houses and small apartment complexes, their paint peeling in the Tennessee heat, their porches sagging under the weight of time and neglect. Families here worked hard for modest wages. They knew their neighbors. They watched out for each other's children. On Lillian Street, where Tabitha lived with her mother and younger brother, the morning routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Tabitha Tuders was a quiet girl, petite for her age, with long brown hair she wore in a ponytail and a shy smile that appeared infrequently but genuinely. She was not the type to seek attention. Her teachers described her as diligent, never causing trouble, always completing her assignments on time. She had a small circle of friends at school and spent most of her free time at home, helping her mother with household chores or watching television with her younger brother. Her mother, Bo Tuders, worked long shifts as a server at a local restaurant, often leaving before dawn and returning after dark. The family's apartment was small, 2 bedrooms on the second floor of a weathered building with thin walls and creaking stairs. On the morning of April 30th, 2008, Tabitha woke at 6:15, just as she did every school day. The alarm clock on her bedside table buzzed softly. Outside, the sky was still gray with the remnants of night, though the birds had already begun their morning chorus. She dressed in jeans and a purple shirt, packed her backpack with textbooks and homework, and ate a quick breakfast of cereal at the small kitchen table. Her mother had already left for work. Her younger brother was still asleep in the room they shared. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Gallatin Pike. At 6:40, Tabitha left the apartment, pulling the door closed behind her with a soft click. She descended the exterior stairs, her sneakers making light tapping sounds on the metal treads. The morning air was thick with moisture, the kind of humidity that clings to skin and makes hair frizz. She walked down Lillian Street toward the corner of South 5th Street, where the school bus stopped every morning at 6:50. It was a walk she had made hundreds of times, less than 2 blocks from her front door. The street was lined with parked cars, their windshields beaded with dew. A few neighbors were already awake, lights glowing in windows, the smell of coffee drifting through screen doors. Tabitha never made it to the bus stop. At 6:52, the school bus arrived at the corner of Lillian and South 5th. The driver, a woman who had driven this route for 11 years, waited the customary 3 minutes. She saw no sign of Tabitha. This was unusual. Tabitha was punctual, reliable, never late. The driver noted the absence but assumed the girl was home sick. She pulled away from the curb and continued her route. By 7:15 that morning, a neighbor walking her dog discovered Tabitha's backpack lying on the sidewalk near the bus stop. It was unzipped, its contents scattered. A math textbook, a spiral notebook with Tabitha's name written on the cover, a pencil case. The neighbor, recognizing the items, felt an immediate flutter of concern. She gathered the backpack and its contents and brought them to the apartment manager's office. When Bo Tuders returned home from her shift at 3:30 that afternoon, she found her daughter's backpack waiting for her. Her stomach dropped. She called Tabitha's cell phone. No answer. She called the school. They confirmed Tabitha had not attended classes. She called Tabitha's friends. None had seen her. By 4 o'clock, Bo was in her car, driving through the neighborhood, calling her daughter's name out the window. By 4:30, she was at the East Nashville police precinct, filing a report. The initial police response was measured. Teenage runaways were not uncommon in this part of the city. Officers took down the information, asked routine questions about Tabitha's state of mind, her friendships, any recent arguments or disciplinary issues. Bo insisted this was different. Tabitha would not run away. She had no reason. She was a good girl, responsible, predictable. She would never leave without telling someone. By nightfall, officers were canvassing the neighborhood. They knocked on doors, asked residents if they had seen anything unusual that morning. Most people had been getting ready for work or school themselves, too preoccupied to notice a single girl walking to a bus stop. But one witness came forward with information that would prove crucial. A woman who lived on Lillian Street, just a few houses down from Tabitha's apartment, reported seeing a white van parked near the bus stop around 6:45 that morning. She had noticed it because it was idling, the engine running, but no one got out. She could not see the driver clearly, could not provide a license plate number, but she remembered the van distinctly because it was out of place. At 7:15 that evening, a second discovery sent chills through the search teams. A pair of sneakers, later confirmed to belong to Tabitha, were found in an alley behind a row of businesses on Gallatin Pike, approximately 6 blocks from her apartment. The shoes were placed neatly side by side, as if someone had carefully removed them and set them down. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric. Just the shoes waiting in the growing darkness. By midnight, the search had expanded. Volunteers from the community joined police officers, spreading out through East Nashville with flashlights and handheld radios. They searched vacant lots, abandoned buildings, drainage ditches. They called Tabitha's name into the humid night. The only response was the echo of their own voices and the chirping of crickets. The swing set at a nearby playground hung motionless in the still air. The street where Tabitha had walked that morning was now cordoned off with yellow tape, illuminated by the harsh glare of police floodlights. The immediate aftermath was a blur of activity and growing dread. Tabitha's face appeared on local news broadcasts. Flyers were printed and distributed throughout Nashville. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation became involved, bringing additional resources and expertise. Search teams expanded their radius, covering miles of urban landscape, questioning hundreds of residents, reviewing surveillance footage from nearby businesses. But the trail was already cold. Tabitha had vanished with an efficiency that suggested planning, knowledge, intent. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Part 2. The investigation, the search operation that unfolded over the following weeks, was massive in scope. Law enforcement agencies from across Davidson County coordinated their efforts, dividing East Nashville into grid sections and systematically combing each area. Teams of officers walked shoulder to shoulder through wooded areas behind apartment complexes. They waded through creek beds and searched beneath bridges. Cadaver dogs were brought in, their sensitive noses trained to detect the scent of human remains. The dogs alerted in several locations, but each alert led to false positives. Discarded animal carcasses, decaying trash, the residual odors of a city's forgotten corners. The community response was overwhelming. Hundreds of volunteers showed up at staging areas, ready to help in any way possible. They distributed flyers, organized vigils, raised funds for the family. Local businesses donated food and supplies for search teams. Churches held prayer services. Tabitha's school assembled in the gymnasium, students and teachers alike holding candles and sharing memories. The media coverage was constant. Television crews camped outside the Tudors' apartment. Reporters interviewed neighbors, teachers, anyone who might offer insight into what happened. National news outlets picked up the story. Tabitha's face became familiar across the country. But as days turned into weeks, investigators began noticing inconsistencies that troubled them. The white van mentioned by the witness on Lillian Street became a focal point of inquiry. Detectives interviewed every resident and business owner in the area, asking about white vans, unusual vehicles, strangers in the neighborhood. They reviewed registration records for white vans in Davidson County. The list was extensive. Officers began the painstaking process of locating and interviewing each owner, documenting their whereabouts on the morning of April 30th. One name that emerged during this process belonged to a man named Timothy Marquis Perry. Perry was 38 years old in 2008, a mechanic who lived approximately 3 miles from Tabitha's apartment. He owned a white work van which he used for his mobile repair business. When detectives first contacted Perry on May 7th, asking routine questions about his vehicle and his activities on April 30th, he was cooperative and calm. He stated that on the morning in question, he had been home asleep. He lived alone and had no one to corroborate his alibi, but this was not unusual for someone who worked irregular hours. He allowed officers to inspect his van. They found tools, parts, grease stains, the ordinary detritus of a mechanic's work life. There was no evidence linking the van to Tabitha's disappearance. Still, something about Perry caught the attention of investigators. Those who knew him said he was quiet, kept to himself, had few friends and no romantic relationships they were aware of. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about Perry's demeanor during the interview. He seemed almost too calm, too composed for someone being questioned about a missing child. He showed no visible emotion, no expression of concern or sympathy. When asked directly if he had seen Tabitha or knew anything about her disappearance, he looked the detective straight in the eye and said, "I do not know that girl. I have never seen her. I was not in that neighborhood that morning." Detectives began building a timeline, trying to verify Perry's account. They canvassed his neighborhood, asking residents if they had seen his van on the morning of April 30th. No one could say with certainty. They checked traffic cameras along routes between Perry's home and East Nashville. In 2008, such cameras were less common and less sophisticated than they would later become. The footage that existed showed hundreds of white vans traveling through the city that morning. None could be definitively identified as Perry's. Physical evidence remained frustratingly sparse. Tabitha's backpack and shoes had been sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Forensic Laboratory. Technicians examined them for fingerprints, DNA, trace fibers, anything that might provide a lead. The backpack yielded only Tabitha's own fingerprints and those of the neighbor who had found it. The shoes were clean, showing no signs of having been forcibly removed or indicating struggle. There were no foreign fibers, no biological material, no chemical traces that might indicate where they had been or who had handled them. Investigators returned repeatedly to the question of the shoes. Why had they been removed and placed so carefully in that alley? The location was not random. It was visible from the street but set back enough to avoid immediate notice. It suggested someone who knew the area, who had thought about where to leave them. Detectives theorized that the shoes were a message, a taunt, or perhaps simply a disposal of evidence that might slow a victim down or leave distinctive tracks. The odometer reading on Perry's van became a point of interest. When detectives first examined the vehicle on May 7th, they noted the mileage. When they requested to inspect it again 2 weeks later, the mileage had increased by exactly 214 miles. Perry explained he had been working, traveling to job sites around Nashville and the surrounding counties. He provided receipts and invoices for work performed during those 2 weeks. The paperwork checked out. The mileage seemed consistent with the claimed travel, yet something nagged at investigators. The distance from Perry's home to Lillian Street and back was approximately 6 miles. 6 miles that could easily be hidden within 214 miles of legitimate travel. As spring turned to summer, the investigation began to slow. Leads dried up. Tips that initially flooded the hotline decreased to a trickle. The media moved on to other stories. The yellow tape came down from Lillian Street. Life in East Nashville resumed its rhythm, though the absence of Tabitha Tuders hung over the neighborhood like a shadow. Bo Tuders continued to plead for information, appearing on television whenever a producer would have her, posting flyers throughout the city, maintaining a website dedicated to finding her daughter. But as the months passed, even her public appeals became less frequent, her voice hoarse with grief and exhaustion. Detectives never officially cleared Timothy Perry as a person of interest, but they had no evidence to justify charges. They maintained surveillance on him for several months, documenting his movements, his phone calls, his interactions. He went to work, came home, occasionally stopped at a bar or a grocery store. He spoke to no one about Tabitha. He showed no signs of stress or guilt. He continued his life with the same quiet routine he had always maintained. By December 2008, the case was effectively cold. A small team of detectives continued to review tips and follow up on occasional leads, but active investigation had ceased. The file remained open. Tabitha's face remained on the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's list of missing persons, and somewhere in East Nashville, someone knew what had happened to her. Part 3. The silence time has a way of dulling even the sharpest pain, though it never truly heals certain wounds. For Bo Tuders, the months following Tabitha's disappearance were a descent into a fog of grief and desperate hope. She could not bring herself to pack away her daughter's belongings. Tabitha's room remained exactly as it had been on the morning of April 30th. The bed was made, the school book stacked on the desk, the posters on the walls fading slowly in the sunlight that filtered through the window. Bo slept on the couch most nights, unable to face the emptiness of her own bedroom, the silence that had replaced the sounds of her children's voices. By the summer of 2009, 14 months after Tabitha vanished, Bo made the difficult decision to relocate. The apartment on Lillian Street had become unbearable, every corner haunted by memory, every sound outside a cruel reminder of hope disappointed. She found a small house in a different part of Nashville, away from the streets where her daughter had walked, away from the bus stop where everything had changed. Her younger son, now a teenager himself, struggled with the move. He had nightmares frequently, waking in the dark hours calling for his sister. Those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the slow poison of suspicion creep into relationships once marked by trust, might understand the psychological weight that settled over the remaining Tuders family. There were no answers, only absence and the terrible possibility that they might never know. The marriage of Bo Tuders, already strained by financial stress and the demands of single parenthood, did not survive the loss. The man she had been seeing casually before Tabitha's disappearance drifted away, unable to bear the weight of her grief. She withdrew from friends, from social connections, from anything that required her to pretend normalcy. Work became mechanical, a series of motions performed without thought or feeling. Customers at the restaurant where she served noticed the change. The bright, talkative woman they had known had been replaced by someone hollow, going through the necessary routines of survival. Meanwhile, Timothy Perry continued his life in apparent tranquility. He worked his repair jobs, maintained his van, paid his bills on time. Neighbors in his apartment complex rarely saw him and had little to say about him when asked. He was not friendly but not hostile. He did not attend community events, did not socialize at local bars, did not join churches or clubs. He was, by all accounts, a ghost moving through the world, leaving barely a trace of his passage. But those who study human behavior, who understand the patterns of guilt and conscience, might have noticed small, revealing moments had they been watching closely. Perry had difficulty sleeping. Lights in his apartment could be seen burning at 3 and 4 in the morning. He started drinking more heavily, purchasing bottles of whiskey with increasing frequency. His work became less reliable. Customers complained about missed appointments, incomplete repairs. In the summer of 2010, 2 years after Tabitha's disappearance, Perry lost his mechanic's certification after failing to renew required training. His business, already struggling, effectively collapsed. Law enforcement had not forgotten about Perry. Detective Sarah Wilkins, who had been part of the original investigation, kept the case file on her desk. She reviewed it periodically, looking for connections she might have missed, patterns that might emerge with the perspective of time. She maintained contact with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Unit. She attended conferences on missing persons investigations, hoping to learn new techniques that might break the case open. And she waited, with the patience of someone who understood that in investigations like these, the truth sometimes emerges years later. When someone's conscience finally breaks or a new witness finds the courage to speak. In 2012, 4 years after Tabitha vanished, a small development rekindled hope. A woman contacted the police tip line claiming to have information about the case. She stated that she had been in a relationship with a man in 2008 who had made disturbing comments about young girls. The man had owned a white van. When detectives followed up, they discovered the man in question had died in 2010 from health complications. The tip led nowhere, but it reminded investigators and the public that the case was not closed, that someone out there still knew what had happened. For Tuders, each false lead was a fresh wound. She had learned to live with the absence, had constructed a fragile equilibrium around the hole where her daughter had been, but every news report, every phone call from police, every well-meaning question from an acquaintance shattered that equilibrium and forced her to relive the morning of April 30th. She started attending support groups for families of missing persons. She met others who carried similar burdens, parents and siblings who existed in the terrible limbo between hope and acceptance. These connections provided some comfort, a reminder that she was not alone in her suffering. The unspoken tensions that marked these years were perhaps most visible in the silence. Friends stopped asking about the investigation. Colleagues stopped mentioning Tabitha's name. The anniversary of her disappearance passed each April with less media attention, fewer vigils, diminishing public interest. This silence was in some ways worse than the initial chaos of the search. It felt like erasure, like the world moving on while Bo remained frozen in 2008, waiting for her daughter to come home. Perry's life, too, was marked by silence. He spoke to almost no one. He worked odd jobs when he could find them, mostly cash work that did not require background checks or references. He moved apartments twice, each time to a cheaper, more isolated location. He gained weight, his appearance becoming unkempt. Those who encountered him in these years described him as sullen, occasionally hostile, always alone. If he carried guilt, He showed no signs of wanting to confess it. If he felt remorse, it remained locked inside where no one could reach it. The breaking point came not with a dramatic confrontation or a sudden revelation, but with the slow accumulation of years and the inevitable progression of technology. In 2014, 6 years after Tabitha's disappearance, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation began a systematic review of cold cases using new forensic techniques and updated databases. Detective Wilkins submitted evidence from the Tuders case for reanalysis. The backpack and shoes went back to the laboratory, this time to be examined with more sensitive DNA testing methods that had not been available in 2008. The results came back in October 2014. Technicians had found a partial DNA profile on the interior fabric of Tabitha's left shoe, in a location consistent with where someone's fingers might grip to remove the shoe from a foot. The profile was partial, not sufficient for a definitive match on its own, but it was enough to enter into the combined DNA index system. The national database, maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If the person who had left that DNA had ever been arrested, had ever submitted a sample for any reason, the database would find a match. The match came back positive in November 2014. The DNA belonged to Timothy Perry. He had been arrested in 2013 for public intoxication, a minor charge that resulted in a night in jail and a mandatory DNA swab. That sample, sitting in the database, had just connected him directly to physical evidence from Tabitha Tuders' disappearance. Part 4. The revelation. The call came to Detective Wilkins on a gray November morning. She was at her desk, reviewing paperwork on an unrelated case when her phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to a technician from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Forensic Laboratory. He spoke clearly and without preamble. "We have a DNA match on the Tuders case. Timothy Perry, you need to come in and review the findings." Wilkins felt her heart accelerate. She had waited 6 years for this moment, had never stopped believing it would come, but now that it had arrived, the weight of it was almost overwhelming. She grabbed her jacket and drove immediately to the laboratory in downtown Nashville. There, technicians walked her through the analysis. The DNA on Tabitha's shoe was degraded, as was expected given its age and exposure to environmental conditions, but the markers present were consistent with Perry's profile. The probability of a random match was approximately 1 in 4 million. It was not absolute certainty, but it was close enough for probable cause. On November 18, 2014, Detective Wilkins assembled a team. They obtained a warrant for Perry's arrest and a second warrant to search his current residence, a basement apartment in a rundown complex on the outskirts of Nashville. At 6 o'clock that evening, as twilight settled over the city, officers moved into position around the apartment. Perry was inside, alone as always. When officers knocked and announced their presence, he opened the door without resistance. His expression when they informed him of the arrest warrant was blank, almost disinterested. He said nothing as they placed him in handcuffs and read him his rights. The search of Perry's apartment yielded disturbing findings. Detectives discovered a collection of newspaper clippings about Tabitha's case, carefully cut out and stored in a manila folder. They found printed photographs downloaded from the internet, images of young girls in school uniforms at bus stops, walking on sidewalks. None of the images were explicit, but the collection itself was chilling in its focus and specificity. In a drawer beneath Perry's bed, wrapped in a towel, they found a single item that stopped every officer in the room: a small purple hair clip. Identical to one Tabitha's mother had described her daughter wearing on the morning she disappeared. Perry was transported to the Davidson County Jail and placed in an interrogation room. Detective Wilkins sat across from him, a recorder running on the table between them. She explained the evidence. She detailed the DNA match, the search findings, the timeline they had constructed. Perry listened without expression. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "I want a lawyer." The interrogation ended there. Perry was arraigned the following morning on charges of kidnapping and murder. He pleaded not guilty. Bail was denied. The case that had haunted Nashville for more than 6 years was suddenly moving forward with startling speed. The media coverage was immediate and intense. National news networks dispatched crews to Nashville. Tabitha's face, unchanged since 2008, appeared once again on television screens across the country. Tuders, now gaunt and aged beyond her years, stood before cameras outside the courthouse and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I knew," she said. "I always knew someone had taken my baby." Thank you to everyone who never stopped looking. Public reaction was divided along familiar lines. Those who had followed the case closely, who had suspected Perry from the beginning, felt vindicated. They flooded social media with comments expressing relief that justice was finally coming. Others, particularly those who had known Perry or lived in his neighborhood, expressed shock. They described him as quiet, harmless, someone who kept to himself. One former coworker told reporters, "I never would have thought he was capable of something like this. He barely spoke. He just did his work and went home." The preliminary hearings revealed the prosecution's strategy. They would build their case on the DNA evidence, the physical items found in Perry's apartment, and a detailed timeline showing Perry had no verifiable alibi for the morning of April 30th, 2008. They would call witnesses to describe Perry's behavior in the days following Tabitha's disappearance, his unusual composure, his lack of cooperation with investigators. They would argue that the collection of news clippings and photographs demonstrated an obsession with the case, a need to follow the investigation and relive what he had done. The defense, for its part, argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial. The partial profile did not prove Perry had harmed Tabitha, only that he had at some point touched her shoe. The items found in his apartment, while disturbing, were not illegal. The news clippings could be explained as the normal interest of someone who had been questioned in a high-profile case. The photographs were disturbing, but not criminal. Without a body, without witnesses to the actual crime, the defense argued the prosecution could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Perry had killed Tabitha Tuders. As the case moved toward trial, a development occurred that would shift everything. In March 2015, a woman named Jennifer Caldwell contacted the district attorney's office. Caldwell had been Perry's neighbor in 2008, living in the same apartment complex. She stated that she had information she had been too frightened to share at the time, but could no longer remain silent. When prosecutors met with her, she described seeing Perry washing his van in the parking lot on the evening of April 30th, 2008. This itself was not unusual, except for the hour. It was after 11 at night, well past when residents typically performed such tasks. She had watched from her window as Perry scrubbed the interior with unusual intensity, using a bucket and brush, working for more than an hour. Caldwell's testimony was powerful, but came with complications. Prosecutors had to explain why she had not come forward in 2008. She stated honestly that she had been afraid, that Perry had always unnerved her, that she had not wanted to get involved. She knew her credibility would be questioned. But her account aligned with the physical evidence and the timeline in ways that were difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The trial began in September 2015. The courtroom was packed each day with reporters, victim advocates, and members of the public who had followed the case for years. Tuders attended every session, sitting in the front row, her eyes fixed on Perry. He sat at the defense table, his expression unchanged from the day of his arrest, showing neither emotion nor interest in the proceedings. Over 3 weeks, the prosecution presented their case. Forensic experts testified about the DNA evidence. Detectives described the investigation, the white van sightings, the timeline discrepancies. Jennifer Caldwell took the stand and described what she had seen that night in April 2008. She spoke clearly, her voice steady, and she acknowledged under cross-examination that she could not say with certainty what Perry had been cleaning or why. But she maintained what she had seen. A man washing a van with unusual urgency late at night on the same day. A young girl had vanished from a location less than 3 miles away. The defense called its own experts to challenge the DNA evidence, to question the chain of custody, to suggest alternate explanations. They portrayed Perry as a socially awkward man who had been unfairly targeted by police because he fit a profile. They argued that the prosecution was asking the jury to convict based on suspicion and circumstantial evidence rather than proof. On October 7, 2015, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. They found Timothy Perry guilty of kidnapping. On the charge of murder, without a body and without direct evidence of death, the jury could not reach consensus. The judge declared a mistrial on that count. Perry was sentenced to 45 years in prison for the kidnapping conviction. Given his age, 55 at the time of sentencing, it was effectively a life sentence. Bo Tuders wept when the verdict was read, not tears of joy but of exhausted relief. She had spent 7 years in a terrible uncertainty. The verdict did not bring Tabitha back, did not answer every question, but it provided something essential. Acknowledgement that her daughter had been taken, that she had not simply vanished, that someone was being held accountable. In the months following the trial, Perry made several attempts to appeal his conviction. Each was denied. He never confessed to harming Tabitha. He never revealed what had happened to her, or where her remains might be found. Detectives continued to search based on tips and analysis of areas Perry was known to frequent, but as of 2016, Tabitha Tuders had not been found. The case of Tabitha Tuders stands as a testament to the persistence of investigators who refuse to let cold cases remain forgotten, and the enduring love of families who never stop searching. It reminds us that justice, though delayed, can still arrive. That truth has a way of emerging even from years of silence. For Bo Tuders, the conviction brought not closure but a different kind of burden. The knowledge of what happened without the solace of bringing her daughter home. Tabitha was 13 years old when she was taken, a quiet girl walking to a bus stop on an ordinary morning. She deserved better than what happened to her. She deserves to be remembered. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.